Welcome to the discussion. My guests today are Mitchell Shorts, a systems engineer at Thundercat Technology, Ed Kraychik, the manager of Isilon Systems Engineers at Dell Technologies, Oki Mek, the senior advisor to the chief information officer at the Department of Health and Human Services, and Chris Brown, the deputy chief information security officer at the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. Before we get started, let me set some context for our discussion. As agencies shift from cloud first to cloud smart, they have to rethink how and why they're using these off-premise services. The underlying principle of Cloud Smart attempts to give agencies the ability to evaluate their options based on their service and mission needs, technical requirements, and existing policy limitations. The Office of Management and Budget says computing and technology decisions should also consider customer impact, balance against cost, and cybersecurity risk management criteria. Additionally, OMB says agencies should assess the requirements and seek the environments and solutions, cloud or otherwise, that best enable them to achieve their mission goals while being good stewards of taxpayer resources. Sounds pretty simple, right? Pretty straightforward. But recent research found that out of 350 companies, now this is in the private sector, 74% moved applications to the cloud and then back on premise. The research from IHS Markit says the main reason companies move systems back on premises vary from poor cloud performance to mergers and acquisitions to security concerns. While agencies may not have as much flexibility as the private sector, they are sure that some agencies have moved systems back from the cloud after 5 or 7 years ago that they had moved to the cloud initially. This all means agencies must understand what they're trying to accomplish, the cost models for different cloud options, infrastructure, platform, and or software as a service, and balance the needs of data accessibility and security. So what does it take to meet the goals of Cloud Smart and improve citizen services? Well, once again, that's where our panelists come in. Chris, I'm going to start on the end with you to talk about cloud and the strategy of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission with what you're trying to accomplish when you talk about cloud.
So we are moving fairly rapidly into the cloud. We were fortunate to be able to hire a cloud architect that looked at what we had existing in the cloud and what we had existing on-prem, did a readiness analysis of where we were as an organization to be able to adopt cloud, and then went on to look at all of our existing applications and has established a roadmap for moving things into the cloud. In addition, we have a strategy for what we do adopt. We first look for a shared service, and then we look for a SaaS, and then we look for a PaaS, and then we look for infrastructure as a service. And so we are moving in that direction. Standing up, we stood up a PaaS last year, and our infrastructure as a service is it's actually larger than I thought we would get to. And then we've got a number of SaaS services, like 43 SaaS services that we've adopted, and I expect that we'll continue to move in that direction. And everything that you cited for the Cloud Smart is the way we approach it. I know that when we had Cloud First as an initiative, there were a lot of agencies that just did the lift and shift, and they moved everything into the cloud. They had to containerize because a lot of them were legacy systems, and that might be the folks that have decided that they need to move it back on-prem, right? We're taking an assessment approach of everything and really adopting the Cloud Smart.
I'm fascinated by the cloud readiness assessment you did. Was that something that came about because you had applications and you were like, okay, what do we do? Or give me a sense of how you guys decided that that's the first step, or among the first steps.
I really have to give the credit to our cloud architect who said, okay, this is what we need to do, right? Because we need to see where we are as an organization. And if we put everything up in the cloud, how are we connecting to that? How are we securely connecting to that? What's the bandwidth that's available to us? So she looked at what else we needed to do from an infrastructure standpoint for us to be ready to continue to move things into the cloud.
Excellent. Now, hopefully no one will come steal that person now because...
That's right. That's why I did not share her name.
Exactly. Okay, let's talk about HHS, a much bigger agency than NRC, but you guys also have been on a path. I know I've talked to your CIO, Jose Arrieta, and the CIOs before him, who have been talking about cloud for some time.
Yes, so we are looking to create a cloud strategy, and we're taking a business approach in terms of aligning it with the mission of HSS. From the missions, visions, value, also looking at the business aspect as a whole as well. We're not just looking at this as an IT project. I never say, I always say that there's no such thing as IT project. There's a business project with IT components. We are looking across the board, looking at acquisition, HR, IT, security, finance as well, and just looking at holistically, because you can't just focus on IT when you try to move to the cloud. We're also looking at a strategy called pace layering model in terms of, because things are changing so fast, so we're trying to categorize applications in terms of what changes are going to happen in the next couple of years. Some application that doesn't change often are administrative systems, administrative application like HR, finance, outside of just routine maintenance. They don't change often. We're also looking at some system that's specific to HSS that may change more often, and then also systems that are we're looking to innovate that might, we might be looking into more infrastructure as a service, because we want to have more flexibility in terms of innovation. And lastly, we are looking at exit strategy as well, as Chris had mentioned, as well as Jason. In some cases, going to the cloud may not work, so you got to have an exit strategy, either to bring back on-prem or to actually move from one cloud provider to the next. So that's our overall high-level overview of the strategy.
You mentioned that you guys are starting to work on a strategy. Previously, how did you kind of move to the cloud? Was it the FDA did their thing and NIH did their thing with some kind of overarching guardrails, or how did it work at HHS?
HHS is very federated. It's a big agency. Just collaborating and exchanging ideas and exchanging initiatives, I think, is the approach. Looking things holistically, but when you think about IT cloud strategy, it's almost very similar to HR department. Think about that. HR doesn't really manage the people that they bring in, but they provide guidance around training, onboarding, offboarding, policies, just around staff resources. I think that could be applied to cloud strategy as well, because there's got to be some governance, and it's something that you could apply and reuse over and over again. You can't have things doing in silos, and HSS is so huge that it could get to that if we don't look at it almost as an HR department for cloud department.
It's a great analogy, because I think people get it. Like people hire people all the time, but if you can't have one person hiring all the time, it's going to have a big backlog. Let me turn to Ed now. Dell Technologies, you guys are providing agencies with a lot of help when it comes to moving to the cloud. What are some of the trends you're seeing from your government customers around as they move to the cloud?
Well, first I want to make a comment about how impressed I am to see the executive CIO do the shift last year from Cloud First to Cloud Smart. I mean, that's a strategy that we've always tried to promote within Dell. Really take a data first or an application first perspective, rather than just being like, a broad brush wipe of we're putting all our data in the cloud or something like that. It really, there's strategies around the criticality of the applications that need to be run, the protection of the data, being able to really assess the value of what we're putting in the cloud and how we're securing it and all that. So from that perspective, it's great to see the government just in general and our government customers taking that approach. I mean, the strategy we take is really one of assessment and evaluating the applications, evaluating the data, evaluating the security and cost of moving things to the cloud, and also the agility of being able to move data into the cloud or move applications to the cloud or back, depending on what the economics of the applications and the data need to be.
It's interesting you bring up the shift that was made. When the government first started down this cloud first, it was so new, and we got to get off the legacy systems, and in many cases the lift and shift was a good idea. And then it kind of occurred to a lot of CIOs over time that, oh, well, I have such peaks and valleys, the cost of when I hit a peak is tough, or when I hit a valley, or the opposite, I think, is also true, where I'm spending a lot more when it's just a maintain. Do you see that conversation happening when you talk to government clients, that they're saying, this is the type of system that probably wouldn't work for the cloud, and this is? I mean, is that understanding?
Yeah, very much so. I mean, we do assessments in terms of, the cost of accessing data in the cloud, and the egress costs and things like that, and do that as a comparison to potentially being an on-prem cloud, so we don't have to deal with those costs. Again, it depends on the interactivity of the data, how much it's being accessed, how frequently, the size of the data that's being moved around. So from that perspective, yes.
Mitchell, jump in here, talk a little bit about and build off of what Ed said about what you're seeing from government clients. What's the type of conversations you're having?
So conversations are around understanding the different cloud providers that are out there. And then to Chris's point earlier, having that exit strategy so they are not married to one vendor. There's been cloud providers that have failed, and then how do you get your data out? And there's situations where if you've had too much data in their provider, they're set to close at a certain date, you may not be able to get all your data out. So understanding that that's a real risk in cloud where we don't have that risk on-prem is something that we're trying to have with customers. Also understanding one of the customers I cover is in healthcare industry as well. And they're also trying to figure out how to put their archive up there. And we're talking a multi-petabyte archive of images that takes significant amount of time to migrate, maintain, but they want to try and get that off-prem. So kind of to Ed's point is, who's going to access that? Well, now that they're talking about doing AI/ML workloads, they might start accessing that data where in the past they weren't. So there's new trends to their data that they haven't had before and haven't trended in the past. So they may see access patterns that weren't previously there. So trying to guide them through things like that.
You bring up stuff like AI, ML. We'll probably get to that a little bit later in the conversation. But let me back us up for a second. There's been some very, we'll used to call it famous or infamous, maybe is the better word, agencies who have moved to the cloud. Then all of a sudden the vendor went out of business, and then they were stuck. How much of that preparation is being done on the front end? Meaning, in the contracts or in the discussions, are agencies telling Thundercat, for instance, oh, by the way, we own our data and we can get our data whenever we want? Or is that conversation happening much later in the, almost after the fact?
Both.
Both.
So, unfortunately, it's both because it's agency by agency where some of them don't have the foresight or they have a local copy. So, if it's in the cloud and the cloud provider goes away, they said, okay, well, we just have our local copy and we're fine. So I think some of it depends on their strategy of how they maintain that data, how they're maintaining that redundancy of their data and resiliency of their data to drive that.
I want to go back to something that Chris said, and actually Ed also built upon. So let me start with Chris, since the readiness assessment that Ed described, and your cloud architects seem to do the same one. Was there a decision that was made of, okay, how do we move certain workloads to the cloud and how we don't, and what type of cloud? Like, okay, this makes sense for infrastructure, or this makes sense for software?
So, yes.
Yes, of course.
We looked at a need for an infrastructure as a service so that we could more easily access a lot of other providers. And so, and I'm not going to name names, but we went with one that's widely used, survivable, and we're building out in that environment, essentially building our own little, infrastructure so that we can connect back to our on-prem. But then also it gives us big pipes to the other providers that we're already using. So that was one of the big findings that we needed, right? You can't really service everybody by using a bunch of software as a service or even shared service, because that's a pipe from you to that, and you're continually just doing those multiple hops, right? The connectivity to this one provider is allowing us to do a single hop to that provider, and then like I said, big pipes out to the other providers.
Would you call it the hub and spoke model in some ways, where the hub is maybe your data center with another hub, the other big cloud provider, and then everything else?
Sure, I would go with that, because we've still got stuff on-prem, right?
Always.
And it's going to take us a while, and there will likely be some things that we do not move, right? Everything we have, well, not everything, but the majority of what we have is moderate, so we need moderate protections. There is some stuff that needs high. We're going to consider a high environment, but there's stuff that we're just simply going to leave here, and we know that going in.
Ed, one of the things that I've heard time and again as we've covered cloud is agencies start with infrastructure, then they slowly move to platform, and then they go to software. But over the last, year and a half, it's been a bigger jump to software. Is that because they're getting better at making these assessments?
I think the software as a service, the services have become better and more prolific. So I think it makes, you don't need to take that stepwise jump anymore. Now you can evaluate the application service that you're looking to provide to your customers or whatever, and say, I can go ahead and contract out it already exists. I don't have to build it, or I don't have to assess for it. You know, that from that perspective, I think there's a lot of good service providers out there already now that we don't have to build it from the ground up.
Maybe that's the biggest difference between today and 2012 or 2013 is that you all understood the software thing a little better.
Yep.
Of course they agree. Let me just ask Oki real quick, when you guys look at which workloads make sense, or how do you give, for instance, work with FDA or CMS, how do you help them understand which workloads make sense for the cloud?
I think there's no one size fits all in terms of cloud strategy or what needs to go to cloud or what not needs to go to cloud. I think categorization and prioritization is the key in terms of what could be a good candidate to go to the cloud. Like I mentioned earlier, pace layering technique is a very good technique in terms of things are changing so rapidly that you figure out which application is going to change so often, which doesn't change that often, and which doesn't really change much at all. So you bucket those area, and also you're looking into we might still have some mainframe systems that that might be critical that we might want to look at. I think there's an opportunity to modernize why you are looking at cloud strategy. And you mentioned machine learning. I'm a little bit jumping ahead, but if you look at the data, there's a lot of commonalities, a lot of overlaps in terms of what systems are doing the same things. But if you look at the data and using machine learning to cluster and standardize the data, you could really map the data and see which system is doing what and which systems are actually doing the same thing. I think there's a good opportunity here to consolidate and to cut down on systems, because from a cybersecurity perspective, it's a little scary going to the cloud in some cases, because security has to be really the #1 priority, because we are just moving to the cloud rapidly in a manner doesn't have strong governance around the move. So that's a concern from a cybersecurity perspective.
All right, you hit two big topics: data, ML, security. All of them we're going to talk about in the next segment. Let's take a quick break. You're listening to the discussion, Cloud Migration and Optimization for Government, sponsored by Thundercat Technology and Dell Technologies on Federal News Network.